Christmas Eve 2002. A young, pregnant wife vanishes without a trace. Her husband tells police he was fishing alone, miles away from home. But as the investigation unfolds, a chilling story of lies, betrayal, and suspicion emerges. This is the case that divided America, captivated millions, and still sparks debate to this day. This is the story of Scott Peterson. On the morning of December 24th, Laci Peterson was seen walking her dog near her home on Covina Avenue. Neighbors remember her as cheerful, radiant with the glow of pregnancy, and excited to welcome her first child, a son she and her husband Scott planned to name Connor. But that afternoon, Scott Peterson made a phone call that would begin a chain of events no one could have foreseen. He told family and police that when he returned home from a solo fishing trip, Laci was gone. On the morning of December 24th, Laci Peterson was seen walking her dog near her home on Covina Avenue. Neighbors remember her as cheerful, radiant with the glow of pregnancy, and excited to welcome her first child, a son she and her husband Scott planned to name Connor. But that afternoon, Scott Peterson made a phone call that would begin a chain of events no one could have foreseen. He told family and police that when he returned home from a solo fishing trip, Laci was gone. But behind that picture-perfect image, cracks were forming. And soon, the illusion would shatter. As days turned into weeks, the search for Laci Peterson became a national obsession. Candlelight vigils filled the streets. Posters and banners stretched across California. Volunteers scoured fields, rivers, and highways. Yet, despite the efforts, there was no sign of Laci or her unborn son. The pressure was mounting, and suspicion began to shift. Reporters noticed that Scott rarely showed visible grief. Instead of pleading for Laci's safe return, he sometimes appeared distracted, even distant. And soon, a stunning revelation would turn this missing person case into something far darker. On January 24th, 2003, exactly 1 month after Laci vanished, the case took a dramatic twist. A massage therapist named Amber Fry came forward with a shocking claim. She had been in a romantic relationship with Scott Peterson, and he had told her he was single. Even more disturbing, just weeks before Laci disappeared, Scott had confided to Amber that this would be his first Christmas without his wife. He said those words while Laci was alive and well, still carrying their unborn child. The revelation shattered the public's sympathy for Scott. The grieving husband was now a prime suspect. But investigators still needed proof, and soon, the waters of the San Francisco Bay would reveal the truth. With Amber Fray's testimony, Scott Peterson's carefully constructed facade began to unravel. Modesto police, who had once treated him as a grieving husband, now turned their full attention on him as the prime suspect. His alibi, once seemingly straightforward, was riddled with inconsistencies. He claimed he went fishing in the San Francisco Bay on Christmas Eve, alone, while his wife prepared for the holiday. But officers asked the obvious question, who goes fishing in winter on Christmas Eve while the pregnant wife is home? Investigators began retracing Scott's steps. They discovered that on the morning Laci disappeared, he had visited his warehouse, hitched his boat, and driven 90 miles west to the Berkeley Marina. Security cameras confirmed his presence. But what struck detectives as odd was the boat itself. It was small, flimsy, hardly the kind of vessel a man would use for leisure fishing. So why was Scott so insistent he had gone there? Police quietly suspected the bay might hold the answer. Meanwhile, the case exploded in the national media. Cable news channels like CNN and Court TV broadcast daily updates. Tabloids plastered Scott's face next to Amber Fray's. Talk shows debated his guilt before trial had even begun. And through it all, Scott played the role of the grieving husband, but inconsistently. At one vigil for Laci, he appeared distant, his eyes scanning the crowd rather than focusing on the photos of his missing wife. At another, he slipped away to take phone calls from Amber, pretending he was in Paris, attending New Year's Eve celebrations. The deception was chilling, and soon, the public turned against him. Amber Fray's decision to go public was critical. She agreed to work with police, secretly recording her phone conversations with Scott. In these calls, Scott appeared calm, manipulative, and disturbingly detached. He spoke of traveling internationally, of needing time to himself, even as Amber pressed him about Laci's disappearance. Detectives now had a window into the double life Scott had been living. One where he juggled the image of a caring husband with the lies of a bachelor pursuing another woman. As weeks passed, investigators uncovered a series of red flags. They found a receipt showing Scott had purchased a boat just weeks before Laci vanished, and had research tides in the San Francisco Bay on his computer. Cadaver dogs taken to his warehouse reacted strongly to certain areas, though results were not definitive. More troubling, Scott's behavior after Laci's disappearance grew increasingly bizarre. He traded in Laci's Land Rover for a truck, sold their home, and even tried selling her belongings. To friends and family, it looked less like a man clinging to hope, and more like someone preparing for a new life without his wife. By early 2003, Scott Peterson had become a household name, not as a victim, but as a villain. The press hounded him relentlessly. Neighbors shouted at him in the street. Even Laci's family, who had initially defended him, began to distance themselves. The once polished image of the handsome husband was replaced with that of a cold, calculating liar. And yet, despite the mounting suspicion, there was still one glaring problem: no body and no hard physical evidence linking Scott to Laci's disappearance. For prosecutors, this was a dangerous gap. They needed more. And in April 2003, the San Francisco Bay finally gave up its secrets. On April 13, 2003, for months after Laci vanished, a couple walking their dog along the Richmond shoreline made a horrifying discovery. The decomposed remains of a late-term fetus had washed ashore. The very next day, a badly deteriorated female body surfaced less than a mile away. DNA testing confirmed the nightmare. It was Laci Peterson and the child she was carrying. The news stunned the nation. The missing person case was now a homicide investigation, and Scott Peterson's time was running out. April 18, 2003. 5 days after Laci and her unborn son were found, police moved in. Scott Peterson was arrested in La Jolla, California, near a golf course. But this was no ordinary arrest. Inside his car, investigators found nearly $15,000 in cash, multiple cell phones, camping gear, his brother's ID, and even a map to Amber Frey's workplace. To prosecutors, it looked less like an innocent man grieving, and more like a fugitive preparing to run. Scott insisted he was simply going golfing, but the evidence told a darker story. As Scott awaited trial, the nation couldn't look away. Court TV broadcast every update, while talk shows and tabloids turned the case into a media circus. Was Scott a cold-blooded killer, or was he being unfairly demonized by the press? To Laci's family, the answer was obvious. They sat in court day after day, waiting for justice. But defense attorneys argued something very different. Without a murder weapon, without eyewitnesses, and with no direct evidence tying Scott to the act, could a jury truly convict him of murder? The trial began in June 2004 in Redwood City, California. Jury selection alone took weeks. Potential jurors were grilled about their views on marriage, infidelity, and capital punishment. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was tense, electric, every seat filled, every eye fixed on Scott Peterson. Prosecutors painted him as a narcissistic cheater, a man who saw his wife and unborn son as obstacles to his freedom. The defense countered, Scott was flawed, yes, but not a murderer. They claimed the media frenzy had poisoned public opinion and turned him into a scapegoat. The most dramatic moment came when Amber Frey took the stand. Calm, composed, and unwavering, she recounted her relationship with Scott, how he told her he was single, how he claimed his wife was gone before Laci even vanished. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as prosecutors played hours of wiretap recordings. In them, Scott sounded manipulative, evasive, and at times chillingly indifferent. For the jury, Amber's testimony painted a picture of motive. Scott wanted a new life, free from the responsibilities of marriage and fatherhood. But beyond the affair, prosecutors leaned heavily on circumstantial evidence. They presented title charts from Scott's computer. They showed the jury the boat he had purchased just weeks before the murder. Experts testified that the location where Laci's body washed ashore was consistent with currents from the Berkeley Marina, where Scott admitted fishing. They even introduced hair evidence found in Scott's boat, later identified as Laci's. Though circumstantial, when combined, the pieces formed a chilling puzzle. The defense fought back fiercely. They argued that the prosecution's case was built on assumptions. The hair in the boat, easily transferred. The title charts, harmless curiosity. The cash and disguises found in Scott's car, coincidental. And without clear forensic proof of how Laci died, the defense insisted no one could say Scott had killed her. They floated alternate theories. Perhaps Laci had been abducted by strangers while walking the dog. Perhaps someone else had placed her body in the bay. It was enough to plant seeds of doubt. But were they enough to overcome the tidal wave of suspicion? After months of testimony, the trial neared its climax. In closing arguments, prosecutors hammered home their narrative. Scott Peterson was a liar, a cheater, and ultimately, a murderer. They played Amber's tapes one last time, reminding jurors of Scott's cold detachment. The defense, in turn, begged the jury not to convict a man on speculation. They warned against letting media pressure dictate justice. The fate of Scott Peterson, life or death, now lay in the hands of 12 strangers. November 12, 2004. The jury filed back into the courtroom. The world watched as the foreman delivered the verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder for the death of Laci Peterson, and guilty of second-degree murder for the death of their unborn son, Connor. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Outside, crowds erupted in cheers and tears. After nearly 2 years of speculation, Scott Peterson was now officially a convicted murderer. The trial didn't end there. The penalty phase followed, where the same jury would decide Scott's fate: life in prison or the death penalty. Laci's mother, Sharon Rocha, gave a heartbreaking statement, describing the pain of losing her daughter and unborn grandson. The jury deliberated once more. On December 13, 2004, they delivered their decision: death by lethal injection. Scott Peterson was sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he would await execution. When the death sentence was announced, many believed justice had finally been served. Yet for others, it was the beginning of another chapter in a case that would haunt the American conscience for decades. Scott Peterson was transferred to San Quentin State Prison, a fortress perched on the edge of the San Francisco Bay, home to California's death row. There, he would join more than 700 inmates awaiting their fate. But unlike many who fade into obscurity after conviction, Scott Peterson's name never left the headlines. Almost immediately, Peterson's defense team began filing appeals. They claimed the trial had been riddled with bias, from jurors who consumed too much media coverage to prosecutors who leaned too heavily on circumstantial evidence. In 2020, nearly 2 decades after the verdict, the California Supreme Court agreed, overturning Peterson's death sentence. Though his conviction for murder remained intact, Scott was no longer condemned to die. Instead, he was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Laci's family, it was another painful twist in a saga that seemed endless. But the courtroom wasn't the only place Scott Peterson was tried. In the court of public opinion, his guilt or innocence was fiercely debated. Television specials, documentaries, podcasts, and even dramatized films all revisited the case. Some argued Scott was railroaded, a man destroyed by media sensationalism and a system desperate for closure. Others saw him as the epitome of arrogance and betrayal, the husband who murdered his wife and unborn child to pursue a life of selfish freedom. To this day, opinions remain divided. For Laci's family, however, the debate was personal and devastating. Every appeal, every headline, every documentary forced them to relive their loss. Sharon Rocha, Laci's mother, became an advocate for victims' rights, using her voice to ensure her daughter's memory wasn't overshadowed by the man who took her life. In Modesto, memorials to Laci and baby Connor still draw mourners each year, a reminder that behind the legal battles and media frenzy lies a simple, enduring tragedy: a young woman and her unborn son, gone too soon. The Scott Peterson case endures not just because of its brutality, but because it raises haunting questions. How well do we truly know the people closest to us? Can love and betrayal live side by side? And how does a system balance justice with fairness when the world is watching? Nearly 2 decades later, the murder of Laci Peterson remains one of the most infamous cases in American history, a story of marriage, lies, and a family torn apart forever. What do you think? Was justice truly served in the Scott Peterson case? Or was this a tragedy twisted by the power of media and public perception? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this deep dive compelling, make sure to like, subscribe, and share. It helps us bring you more stories from the darkest corners of true crime. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious.